The following video is an illustration of the task in hand. If you prefer to have us do the job, please contact Emma or Rob at Amazon Cars. Here's the spread of tools needed to rebuild the M40 gearbox and the components that are going to go into it. The lay shaft may not have to be replaced. You'll have to be inspecting that during the assembly. First we take the gearbox front seal and pop that out of its housing. And discard it. Make sure you insert the new seal the correct way round. And using a suitable drift, press it into the housing. We turn our attention to the input shaft. First of all, we pop off the circlip that secures the bearing on the shaft. And press the shaft off the bearing. And discard. Fitting the new bearing. We use a suitable support so that we clearly only press on the inner ring of the bearing, therefore we cannot damage the bearing itself. And press the shaft firmly into the bearing. And replace the circlip. Now we put the rollers into the input shaft. So a thin smear of grease to hold them in place. And insert each in turn carefully. Final bearing should locate neatly. And that's our input shaft all done, and we set aside that until final assembly. Next we get the lay gears, and we're going to do the roller bearings on these. The 2 spacer rings each end are laid in readiness. In goes the spacer ring, a thin smear of grease to hold the rollers in place. And insert the roller one by one into the lay gear. Doesn't that look beautiful? Another thin smear of grease. To hold the spacer ring in place. And we do the same on the other end of the lay gear. In goes the spacer ring on the second attempt. Our thin smear of grease. And we assemble the roller bearings inside the lay gear. Just make sure those bearings are all square, allowing a neat hole for the final roller. And in it goes. And a neat bit of grease smear for the other spacer ring. That's our lay gear to be set aside now until the final assembly. Now the main shaft. We're going to work at the rear end of it first. So we locate the bearing housing in its support, making sure the gears can't foul the vise beneath it, and using our copper mallet, tap the shaft out of the bearing. Remove the circlip that secures the bearing in the housing. And pop out the rear seal. And we discard the seal. We take out the Speedo drive worm, noting which way up it located. And just tap out the rear bearing. and discard. Using a razor blade, we remove the old gasket and discard. Now this section, embarrassingly, we recorded the wrong bit, but basically we carefully press the new bearing in, pop the circlip in, turn it round, put the speedo drive worm in and press the tail seal. And now we're ready to finish off the back end of the main shaft. Take the spacer ring off. Out comes the gear. The synchro cone. And we're going to replace the synchro spring here. Pop the old spring out, being careful not to disturb the dogs. And if you run your fingers round it, you'll feel the 3 grooves that have been worn into that spring by the 3 dogs. And discard the spring. The new spring goes in the same sense as the old one came out. And noting that the top and bottom springs run in opposite directions whilst locating in the same dog. So we locate the tab of the spring in the dog that the spring came out of and press down. Put on the synchro cone, making sure that it engages correctly with the dogs. Then the gear, the spacer ring, a little smear of grease to help the bearing slide on. And we refit the housing. So that you don't stress the bearing itself, we use the flange to press that bearing down into position. A light smear of grease where the flange interfaces with the tail seal. Just check that that dog is still located correctly, and the synchro cone. And tighten down the flange. You'll see that bearing being pulled onto the shaft, which will ultimately then secure that final gear in position. Just checking the dogs are still located in the right way. And then a final quick buzz on of the nut. Another check that the dogs are all located so that final cog rotates neatly and that the bearing rotates nicely. Good. Now we turn our attention to the front end of the shaft. Out comes the circlip that secures 3rd, 4th synchro. Pop out the synchro spring. Remove the synchro outer. Careful not to lose the 3 dogs. There's one just fell out the front. And pop out the other 2. Now you can slide the synchro up and off the shaft with its cone. Slide off the gear with its spacer ring. Now we have a large snap ring to remove, which needs large snap ring pliers. It's a fearsome old brute to get off this one. And use the gear to slide it up squarely. And we're back at the other side of 3rd, 4th synchro. So we take the remaining spring out, remembering we've already replaced the other spring. And pop the new spring in. Locating it around the dogs. Use the cone to seat it home neatly. There you go. On goes the gear. Back on with the snap ring. Slide it down. Now use the next gear to act like a slide hammer just to get that snap ring seated home neatly. There it goes. And assemble with its synchro cone. Now we assemble the 1st, 2nd synchro gear. So pop out the old synchro spring and discard. I've actually already replaced that synchro spring, although it didn't look it. And fit the other synchro spring. Now, on the rear edge, there's a groove around the outside of the synchro. On the leading edge, there is no groove. So when you put this synchro back on, make sure you've got the groove facing down. Otherwise your gearbox won't work. Ease it down and make sure that the dogs engage in the cone correctly. Back on with the circlip. And the synchro cone. That's our main shaft ready to go. So we now have all the components ready for final assembly and the gasket sets sitting there in the corner along with the lay shaft. We inspect the old lay shaft because they don't always need replacing. Now in this instance I can see that the toughening has started to wear through, primarily on one end. There it is, a whole area covering about a quarter of the circumference. So we're going to discard that lace shaft and fit a brand new one. Clean the packing grease off it. And observe that one end of this shaft has a stepped diameter, whereas the other end has not. It's important that you make a note of which way round this is. The stepped end is what secures the lace shaft into the back of the gearbox. If you fit this wrong way round, which you do occasionally see when a gearbox comes here badly built, the whole gearbox casing is generally destroyed. So we get the gearbox casing out of the oven. It's been preheating at about 90 degrees, which all allows everything to expand and makes life a bit easier in assembly. So we clean up the two bronze thrust washers. Make sure that the internal surface where they'll seat is clean of any old Loctite. If not, then use your hand bastard file to make it good. And put a thin smear of Loctite on the mating surface of the thrust washer. Using the dummy lace shaft to centre it and observing the locating lug in the washer, fit the washer to the inside of the gearbox. Likewise the rear washer, the locating lug, centre it on the dummy lace shaft and locate the washer correctly. Insert the dummy shaft into the lay gear, being careful not to disturb all those beautifully assembled roller bearings. And drop the lace shaft into the bottom of the gearbox squarely, being sure not to disturb those two thrust washers. There it is, sitting loosely in the bottom of the gearbox. Check that all the bearings are happy in the input shaft and gently locate the input shaft in position. Take the front synchro cone off, put it onto the input shaft with one of the dog locations pointing vertically up. Put a smear of grease around the rear bearing housing. And stick the gasket to it. Making sure you get it the right way round. That grease will keep it neatly in place now. Now, with the dog located vertically up of the synchro, we carefully load the main shaft into the gearbox, sliding it forward so it engages in the input shaft's roller bearings. Check the dogs are lining up with the cone, rotate it if necessary. And that main shaft slides neatly into position. Check everything moves freely. And that's the gears all mated together. Now we should have removed the flange before this, so off camera, pop the flange off so that we can get the lay shaft in. The lay shaft has now dropped down to engage in the main shaft and input shaft gears, and you should be able to see that. If you just gently tilt the gearbox as shown, the lay shaft should be clearly visible through the lay shaft hole. Remembering to insert your new lay shaft the correct way round. You might just have to jiddle the lay gear just a slight to get the dummy shaft to slide out. We press the new shaft home, taking the dummy shaft out. And tap the lay shaft home, being very careful not to let either the rear housing separate away from the gearbox or the input shaft, because otherwise you'll have to start again. And tap it home so it's just beyond flush with the gearbox end. That's still just a touch proud. There, we're happy. And you can see the front of the lay shaft is almost flush with the gearbox casing. And there's our assembled gearbox. A light smear of grease on the input shaft where it mates with its seal, and around the housing. To which we stick the gasket. noting the oil drain hole is in the right location. There. Pop the housing on in the correct orientation. And getting a new O-ring, we thread that onto one of the nose bolts. I'll wind that all the way down the thread so it's in the correct position. And nip up the 3 bolts. We turn our attention to the rear housing. Align the gasket and the housing with the bolt holes. And loosely fit the 4 bolts, remembering they're copper washers. The reason we loosely fit them is so that we've got a little bit of play as we insert the selector shafts past the gasket. Put the brass selectors on and noting which way round it goes into the gearbox. Drop first, second selector in. Then put third, fourth selector in. Insert third, fourth rod. And wind that in until it's at the mid-detente. Gently nip up the pinch bolts. Then we insert first, second selector rod. Through first, second selector. And insert the rod till the mid-detente is positioned. Get the roll pin. Tap it gently in. And then using a drift, take it down to its final position. Finally, in goes the reverse selector and its rod. And nip up the pinch bolt. Now do the final tighten on all 3 pinch bolts. Now just quickly run through the gears and make sure they all behave. Reverse, good. Into neutral. Back into first gear. Into neutral. Second gear. Into neutral. Third gear. Neutral. And fourth gear. And just check that neutral is running freely also. On goes the selector shaft housing, having checked the reverse light switch. And finally tighten the rear housing bolts. And showing how that housing now prevents the lay shaft from coming out backwards. On with the flange. Buzz the nut on. And this should then be correctly torqued down while securing the flange. We pop the detent balls back in. And the speedo gear. On goes the nice new O-ring. Grease it. Thin line of grease on the scroll of the speedo gear itself. Pop it in with the pinch bolt hole facing aft. In with the pinch bolt, remembering its copper washer. and gently nip up with your 1/2 inch spanner. Don't overdo this, it's very easy to strip that aluminium thread. Finally, those 3 detent springs go in. There's our M40 gearbox, fully built and ready for your next event. Now hopefully I've made this look simple, but I have been doing this for 18 years. So if you'd like us to do the task for you, just give us a call.